Did you ever wonder how teachers go about deciding the way that they will instruct the students that are learning in their classroom? Sometimes it's dictated by the school district that they work in, but many times they are allowed professional discretion to find the materials that best suit the needs of their students. How did you learn to read? Did you have a more teacher-centered approach, or was the process centered around you as the child? Many times, the approach the teacher takes in teaching those first-time readers how to read determines their success or failure, and it also determines whether they love to read or they dislike reading. I'm sure many of you from this day can still think back and remember how much you either loved learning to read or how much you despised reading. At the end of our presentation today, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on those two questions and really think back about the organization of instruction in your class. On page 7 of your text, figure 1-1 discusses the learning theories in a very organized chart, and I've duplicated the chart for you in this presentation. The organization of how teachers teach literacy is broken down into two main categories. The teacher-centered category, which we see here in purple, and then the remainder of our organizer is the child-centered. And how you decide whether you're more teacher-centered or child-centered really goes back to your philosophy of education. Many of you like that organized, top-down kind of classroom. And when we think about how readers learn based on a teacher-centered classroom, we're really looking at the behavioralism research. And that's focused mainly on the knowledge we have of Skinner. And that explains that children learn to read by mastering skills that are smaller and they build upon one another. So if you think about this in the terms of literacy, we're looking at learning our alphabet letters and then learning our alphabet sounds and then putting them together to make small words. Once we achieve small words, putting them together to make short sentences, and so forth. So you can see, if you were brought up back in the 60s or the 70s and maybe a little bit of the 80s, you probably had a more teacher-centered approach to learning reading. This is when we used the basal readers, and teachers gave you small activities or mini lessons, and then you worked with a lot of pencil and paper tasks. I remember worksheets and workbooks when I learned to read, and that's primarily that knowledge that children learn by breaking it down to the easiest skills and then giving them the harder skills as they go. It also is a system where we want to reward students, so giving them tasks that they can succeed on and giving some sort of external motivation. As we move into the remainder of our chart, you can see the last three learning theories that would guide how we teach literacy in our classroom are child-centered, and they are based on the Constructivism, Sociolinguistic, and information processing theories. Now, if you think back, these theories were probably covered in your educational psychology class or just a plain old psychology class, but even though they differ, they all have characteristics that base learning on the child's control or getting to know individual child strengths and differences to build our instruction. The first theory is Constructivism, and that is based on a few different theories. Piaget's schema theory, where our brains are like filing cabinets and we reach in and we're always building upon what we know and working to what we don't know. Also, the approach to Constructivism is like construction, where children are inquiring. And that inquiry theory from Dewey says that we are constantly curious as children and we engage in play that leads to figuring things out on our own. And for many of you know that when you figure something out on your own, it becomes yours, and it's not just something someone told you. And many times that's a deeper knowledge base. And the constructivism theory really supports that. The last theory of constructivism is based on the engagement theory. And the engagement theory is really when children are interested and motivated in learning, they achieve at higher levels. And we all have probably experienced that as well. And when we're achieving at higher levels and we're liking what we're doing, we have motivation or confidence in ourselves. And the more our confidence grows, the more we want to learn and the more successful we become. And that is a theory that really seems to work in the classroom. A teacher that is following constructivism is going to do things like KWL charts, where we really look at what they know, what they want to know, and then what they've learned, and putting it on themselves. Also, thematic units based on interests or themes that the students would choose for the class to learn. Word sorts you'll see in our classroom as the semester goes on are great because they're inquiry and discovery based, and you take some ownership in what you're doing when you do a word sort. And last is that focus on literature and bringing in engaging, authentic texts that students want to hear and want to read on their own. Now, a different theory that is still child-centered that you might use to teach literacy is sociolinguistic. And the forerunner of sociolinguistic theory is Lev Vygotsky and his zone of proximal development. And basically, there are two parts to that theory. And the first one is children learn from the people that they are surrounded by. So their peers, their parents, the people in their community, and they're learning from each other through interactions that are social. Also, this theory looks at scaffolding, which we'll talk about later on in the presentation. But scaffolding is where we're building upon what they know and what they're interacting with, and we grow that. Within the sociolinguistic theory, we also have some work done on the situated learning theory, and this is basically talking about active learning, where students are working together, much like you'd have a mentor, and learning from each other. Another part of the sociolinguistic theory is the critical literacy component by Freer, and this really looks at just the empowerment of students to want to make changes and take control of what they learn. Now you may think this doesn't really apply if you're teaching primary students, but really engaging them in what's going on in the world and allowing them to hear literature or appropriate news pieces that will get them thinking and taking control of how they'd like to see the world become. This will motivate a certain genre of student to really excel because of that interest and motivation factor and how it connects to their own lives. Now, a teacher that is following a more sociolinguistic theory is going to have a lot of interactions between the students. And so you'll see literature circles where students are leading each other in discussions, shared reading times where both the teacher and the students are reading together. Reading and writing workshop time, which you'll find later on, is a time that is very independent but allows for conversations and conferencing that will guide learning and allow students to really interact socially. And the last one is that author's chair, and that's just giving students the ability to share with others the works that they've done and appreciate one another's art of writing or reading. Again, scaffolding is very important in the sociolinguistic theory because it's looking at what each individual knows and building to the next step of the authentic activities they're engaged in. The last child-centered theory is the information processing model. And this is where we see children really learning through integration of different components in the classroom. The main one here is that students that are readers are better writers and students that are writers are better readers. And we find that by integrating the two and also integrating the content areas, students are learning more and learning more quickly. The focus of this really looks at comprehension as a component in both reading and writing. And we see this through the transactional theory, which is Rosenblatt's theory, and explains how when you are a reader, you're constantly trying to make sense of things. And children's brains try to figure things out. I know my daughter is 5, and she's constantly trying to take things that are not real and make them real. And a lot of times it's text on a page. She'll read a nonsense word and she'll turn it into a word that she knows because she doesn't want words to not be real or not make sense. So we really see children trying to figure things out in this theory. We also see children learning how their brain works. And so we teach them explicitly the metacognition, or thinking about your own thinking. And this is something where children become aware of how their brain works, and it helps them figure things out when they're stuck. Teachers who use a more information processing theory to teach language really would try out guided reading groups where children are working in small groups based around similar ability levels or needs. Also, they're really going to use graphic organizers that integrate reading and writing at the same time. Lots of conversations again, and conferencing, and sharing the pen through interactive writing, whether it be the language experience approach to writing or a shared writing experience. So at this point, you will have to make some decisions when you become a classroom teacher, whether, first of all, you're going to have a teacher-centered classroom or a child-centered classroom when it comes to reading and writing models. But then, which theory or theories do you connect best to and think children would respond best to in your classroom? I'll tell you right now, there's no right or wrong answer. And most children learn to read from their teachers without any difficulty. Teachers that find the most success usually are combining theories, because you'll find, and I know you know as learners, not every single person learns the same way, and what works for you may not work for the learners in your classroom. So by integrating many of these theories and models, we can hit all of the learning needs of the students in our classroom. But you'll need to make some decisions, and at the end of our presentation, again, I'm going to have you kind of check in and let me know what you think you would be most comfortable with. And also, if you've seen some of these things in action in the classrooms you're observing or getting out there volunteering in, let us know what you're seeing and what you like and what you don't like. Okay, we'll move on from here.